Story 1. Mom told me that if I didn't take a bath, I'd get a Russian disease called Rachikakov. I shared that with the teacher and other kids in second grade. Story 2. My third grade teacher told us that grammar rules were decided by a bunch of old people in Washington sitting around the Oval Table. My family still makes fun of me for believing it. Story 3. That my attendance, behavior, and grades in school would be part of my permanent record and impact my life forever. No one has ever asked me about any of that since I finished school. No employer has ever asked anything about any grade at any level of my education. Story 4. That if I didn't behave myself, I would be sent to boarding school. Then I read all the Enid Blyton and other books on girls at boarding school and desperately wanted to go. Me. Can I please go to boarding school? Mom. Don't be ridiculous, we can't afford boarding school. Story 5. Every time you pick your nose, the nostril gets stretched a little bigger. If you pick your nose too many times, it will take over your entire face. My old man is a bit strange. Story 6. This might be too far down the line, but it's still hilarious. I was raised Jewish and we kept kosher at home. For those who don't know, Jewish people who keep kosher are not allowed to eat ham or pork of any kind. At school, I must have tried a friend's sandwich or something. But one day I tried school lunch ham and thought it was the best thing I'd ever had in my entire life. I knew at the time we couldn't eat pork, which in my mind was bacon. I begged my mom for ham, and she kept saying no, I wasn't allowed. I tried behaving really well, and one day she pulled me aside and said, I found kosher ham. You can have it on Fridays if you keep this up. So for a while, I had kosher ham on Fridays at school. Eventually, we all moved on and everything was fine. One day, I'm with my mother-in-law, who was also raised Jewish and kept kosher. We were discussing how terrible kosher foods are, and I opened my stupid mouth and said, as a kid, I got kosher ham, and that stuff was great. My mother-in-law looked at me like I was an absolute idiot because I am. I obviously remembered very quickly that kosher ham is totally not a thing, and that my mother snuck ham into the house for some peace and quiet. Story 7. That cracking your knuckles gives you arthritis. I legitimately believed that for years and used to yell at friends for doing it, only to find out later it's total nonsense. Now I crack mine constantly out of spite. Story 8. That my senior cat, whose health was waning, was taken to a big farm for senior cats where he would be happy and taken care of. I was probably 12. I was horrified and devastated when my dad told me this. I honestly would have taken it better if I was simply told the truth, because then I wouldn't spend years obsessing over how a farm was not a suitable place for him and how much he must be suffering there. The truth only hit me last year when I heard someone make a telling your kids that their pet went to live on a farm joke. The realization was bittersweet. Story 9. When we lived in San Francisco, my dad told me that there was a fog machine. Every night, the fog machine would turn on, and you know it's on because you'd hear the loud toot-toot, and soon after, the fog would roll in. That's just weather. That's what San Francisco is like. There's fog. The toots, yeah, that's the ships coming in. I was way older than I needed to be when I really thought about that. Story 10. Maybe not embarrassing, but my uncle told me carrots cure hiccups when I was tiny. Placebo effect, maybe? I believed it until last year and never had a reason to question it. Funny stuff. Story 11. Some houses have really awesome walls that grow nuts. Walnuts specifically. Raisins are dried grapes that have been plucked of their wings and legs. Guinness is made of blended ingredients. My pet goldfish also occasionally took a vacation and came back with new spots because he had been sunbathing. Story 12. Head lice prefer clean hair. We were taught that at school to reduce the stigma, I guess, and I was an adult before I learned they don't actually care. Story 13. English was my first language, and I have spoken it for the majority of my life. I was trying to learn Russian from my parents, which is their first language. I asked my mom how to say sorry in Russian. She was sort of upset that day about something and jokingly said that sorry didn't exist in Russian. I spread that lie for years until I looked it up. Story 14. If you keep making that face, it will get stuck like that forever. For years, I was genuinely afraid to cross my eyes or make weird expressions for too long, thinking I would end up permanently looking like a cartoon character. Story 15. My pet gerbil, her name was Bambi, lived for 9 years. She occasionally shed her coat and changed color but lived to a good old age because I loved her so much. I had her from the age of 5. I was 21 before I realized I had multiple Bambis. Story 16. You only have so much breath or air in your body, which one day will run out. Technically, it is true, but I now know that it is not the air inside you that you use up. Story 17. My mother would jokingly pronounce abnormal as abinormal as a reference to young Frankenstein. I pronounced the word that way for about 15 years. Story 18. The front passenger seat is called shotgun because if you're sitting up front and are too small or don't have your seatbelt on, you'll shoot out the front windshield like a bullet from a shotgun. A stupid, fun, utterly believable lie to tell a 6-year-old to keep them safe, until it sits in their brain unexamined for over a decade, and he makes a fool of himself at college when he opens his mouth. Story 19. That Buddhist monks were good at fighting as long as they center their energy. They are not good fighters, and there is no such thing as mystical energy. Not a single one can match even a mediocre mixed martial arts fighter. Story 20. When I was a child, I always focused on people's birthmarks and asked my dad, why do people have so many birthmarks, for example, on their neck? He answered that they will fall off with age. I believed it until I was 29 years old when I brought it up in a conversation, and the people around started laughing, saying that they don't fall off. Story 21. When I was younger, we were poor. My mom would always put the word fancy in front of what store we were going to. The fancy bread store, the fancy clothes store, stuff like that. Well, here I am, age 35 or something, and my wife and I drove by the fancy bread store. And I asked my wife if she had ever been there because it was so elite. She was like, yeah, but it's not fancy. That's when I found out it was the day-old bread store where they sell expired or almost expired food. I never knew. My mom also convinced me she would handle all my money that I made growing up, like paper route money and money from the age of 13 or 14 until 17. There was always a lot missing, and she just said it was the bank who charged us, and that's how banks work. Again, I thought that was normal until my wife corrected me. I found out my mom lied to me a lot. Story 22. The Velvet divorce happened because the Czech Republic and Slovakia wanted to have their own hockey teams and win twice as many medals or games as they would have if they stayed one country. I just accepted that as a fact and didn't give it any deeper thought for years. Story 23. I wanted to be vegetarian from a young age. To make me eat red meat, my parents told me that beef and veal were not animals but vegetables. Of course, I had never seen an animal called a veal or a beef, so I believed them. I figured out beef pretty early and then refused to eat it. So from then on, whenever they wanted me to eat red meat, they'd tell me it was veal and that it was vegetarian. I was 16 when I discovered the truth about veal. I was horrified, upset, and angry, and I still am, decades later. My mom still finds it hilarious, which just makes me more angry. Her laughing at me crying made me really hate her, and I swore I would never trust her or confide in her about anything. Do not lie to your kids. Story 24. The Boston July 4th has a mini fireworks show during the 1812 overture that happens an hour or two before the real fireworks. My parents had me convinced that was the fireworks show for my entire childhood, and I didn't find out I was getting sent to bed early until my 20s. Story 25. When my brother and I were probably like 3 and 6, our cat ran away on Christmas Eve and never came back. Dad told us that she must have hopped in Santa's sleigh. Every year we wrote in our letters to Santa for our cat back and made our parents lock away our cat and dog so they couldn't be taken by Santa. I realized there was no Santa about 6 years later and just said, so what happened to the cat? Story 26. My parents kept me believing in Santa Claus until I was 12. I stayed clueless and did not believe the other kids telling me Santa was not real because my parents would type out his letters to me. One year the printer broke and Santa's handwriting looked suspiciously like my mom's. Story 27. My grandmother told me that Kentucky Fried Chicken was made from seagulls. I saw seagulls sitting on top of the spinning Kentucky Fried Chicken bucket outside the store and asked why they were up there. She said the store spreads bird seed up there and they fall through a trapdoor into the bucket, and the employees come out and get them every night to make chicken for the next day. I'm not convinced there isn't some air of truth to this. Story 28. I spent years imagining all of the vegetables that could be improved by adding sugar to the soil, because you make regular potatoes into sweet potatoes by adding sugar to the soil. Story 29. My dad convinced me I was born with a tail and that the doctor had it in a jar in her office. I fully believed him for way too long. I only became suspicious when he started telling my little brother the same thing. Story 30. My mom used to tell me that automated teller machines had men inside that actually dispensed the money. Then one day we happened to walk past one that had a gentleman fixing it, and she was always like, "See, I told you." And because of this, it took me a long time to realize the truth. Story 31. My hometown, Leesburg, Virginia, used to have a huge siren downtown to summon volunteer firefighters. It frequently sounded at night, and my father explained to me that it was the Leesburg lullaby. I thought it was nice that the town was helping children go to sleep, even if it was a weird siren. Story 32. After burning my mouth on hot food, my 9-year-old daughter was like, "Dad, couldn't you see it was hot?" I simply said, "Honey, I have perfect vision, therefore I can't see steam," and left it at that. Years later, she said she brought it up in high school, and kids were laughing their asses off. Story 33. This is pretty niche, but when I was young, my parents told me that if I didn't return library books and DVDs on time, it would affect my credit rating and I wouldn't be able to buy a house. Weird thing to say to a kid, I know. As an adult, when I was applying for a mortgage, my mortgage broker was talking about checking my credit history and asked if there was anything she should know about. I told her that back in high school, I lost a library book and to this day haven't returned it. So embarrassing. Story 34. My dog went to live on a farm. That didn't go how my dad intended. I was angry at him for months for giving my dog away. He should have just told me the truth. Story 35. I was told our border collie was sent to live on a farm. Well, I believed that until I was maybe 20 or so. They are natural herding dogs, and it turned out my dad was allergic. We gave Elmo away, and that family then took him to the farm. Well, from 20 to 27, I believed that dog had actually just died after we gave him away. And how wrong I was. When I brought that up, my mom had pictures of this dog alive on the farm it ended up at. It really did happen. My childhood dog spent its final years on an actual farm. Story 36. Mom said once you are a grown-up, you can do whatever you want. Until then, follow my rules. Well, I've been a grown-up in my own house for some time now, and she still nags me, saying I should do things her way. Story 37. I was told all white people hate black people and to be racist towards whites. I now see that was a direct result of having a racist family and the fact that this family never left their geographical area or experienced enough interactions with other cultures. I am ashamed to say I said some racist things growing up and honestly did not know any better. Story 38. I grew up in a religious family and heard in Sunday school that men had one less rib than women because God took it from Adam to make Eve. I grew up to not necessarily believe the Adam and Eve story but assumed the story was created to explain a fairly easy biological fact that men had fewer ribs. I was in graduate school before learning the whole thing was wrong. To be fair, I'm not a biology guy in general. Story 39. When I was 4 and my brother told me that Christmas Eve was the longest day of the year, he had me convinced it was a 25-hour day. It wasn't until middle school when I was giving a presentation on the longest day of the year that I learned Christmas Eve is a 24-hour day. Story 40. I used to believe that if you swallowed a fruit seed, a tree would grow in your stomach. I was so scared that I always made sure to pick out every single seed. Story 41. When I was a teenager, I was often told that I would never do anything right and never achieve anything. I needed therapy to get that manipulation out of my system. Story 42. My dad always told me that the neighborhood with the no outlet signs meant that they did not have electricity. It seemed odd to me, but it took far too long to realize he was joking with me. I later moved into the same no outlet neighborhood. It was lovely. Story 43. That the alligators living in the sewers of New York City sometimes rose up through the grates on the sidewalk and snatched little kids away. I clearly remember walking around each grate when we visited family in the city, and my parents giving me that Nick is one strange kid. Where did we go wrong? Look. Story 44. That jackalopes were real. My mom went antique shopping a lot when I was a kid and would drag me along. It was very boring to me at that age, so when I got fascinated by all of the taxidermy jackalopes I would see, she told me that they had been real but were hunted into extinction. It made me want to see all the taxidermied ones I could for some reason. Antique shopping got a little more interesting after that until I found out around age 12 or so that they were not actually a real creature that had once existed, but a taxidermy job of gluing small antlers to taxidermy jackrabbits. Story 45. I got the old cat sent to a farm story when she had passed away when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I believed that until I was about 15, and when my dad told me the truth, I bawled my eyes out. Story 46. From age 6 to 15, I was given a grocery list that always included the items headlight fluid and elbow grease as a means to keep me occupied while shopping. The shop was local and the owners were family friends. I always got everything on the list except headlight fluid and elbow grease, but was told they were out. My parents would always say it's all right, maybe next time the shop will have some in stock. At age 16, I was watching a Rooster Teeth short in which Gavin was telling a story about a stunt car driver who finished doing a stunt and thought he wet himself, but it turned out to be the headlight fluid container, and his coworkers absolutely lost it, telling him there's no such thing. This was probably the dumbest moment of the company. Took a few minutes to process, and then it clicked. I told my parents I found out about the headlight fluid and elbow grease, and they were amused. They told me through relieved chuckles, "We were worried you wouldn't get it." They managed to keep that joke running for almost 10 years. I asked them why. They said the number one reason was to keep me occupied and out of trouble, which had worked. When I told the family friends at the shop, they were likewise relieved, worried I was maybe too slow or impressionably naive and that I might be a danger to myself as an adult. But it was still hilarious. The whole store was in on it, helping me search while trying their hardest not to laugh or maintain a poker face.